We stand together, we win together. Come on.
Don't play with my money. Don't play with my family.
We deserve more. Our students deserve more. We have not come this far to settle for so little.
You left these folks no other alternative but to stand here and stand up for what they believe in.
No longer do strikers have to fend for themselves. When they hit the picket lines, many others have their backs.
We have elected officials, we have precinct committeemen, we have teachers, we have the nurses, we have the indivisible groups, we have the environmental groups coming out, activists, and they're hitting the line.
We are very strong. One day longer, union getting stronger. We are fighting for our family. We are fighting for the next generation.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that video. Jobs with Justice thanks all the strikers, now the ones that are going on and the ones that have come before us. My pleasure now to welcome back Jobs with Justice Executive Director Erica Smiley.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for continuing to participate in our conference. We had 200 people the entire time for the morning plenary, and many of you are rolling back in now. So we're really grateful that you are adapting with us. In this plenary, we'd like to talk about bargaining for our future, and it's a first attempt to talk a little bit about our theory of change and strategic approach for this moment. Birthing a new framework for collective bargaining will not happen simply by rallying only those who already have access to 20th century rules and protections. Certainly those of us who have access to union membership and other institutions must protect what we've won. And those who still have the power to win a traditional union contract, particularly a first contract under the current circumstances, should continue to win those. But the remaining 90% plus of working people, most of the traditional channels have been blocked. So building the organizing and collective bargaining power we require for this phase of global capitalism requires a kind of creativity and militancy that could ultimately set up the foundation for establishing a bargaining framework that goes far beyond what was won in the New Deal. Ultimately expanding ways in which working people collectively negotiate together, the types of binding agreements we can win, what we can bargain over, and who we can bargain with. This plenary highlights a snapshot of bargaining models and experiments that help working people call more of the shots and achieve lasting gains. Some of the efforts have been proven successful, some are still actively being tested today, and others are in incubation. The models, by and large, all require that working people are directly at the table with employers and economic decision makers, that an enforceable agreement or other means of collective accountability exists, and that the outcome builds enduring, longer-term power for working people. These models will fall into three distinct approaches discussed in more detail during the discussion. First one is broadening the scope of traditional bargaining, wherein this approach involves worker-driven bargaining that expands the scope of traditional negotiations to subjects that are not necessarily mandated by law, oftentimes bringing in the issues of a broader community and seeing collective bargaining as a site of struggle. The second one is bargaining with the ultimate profiteer. And in these strategies, we're attempting to establish shared bargaining units of formal and informal workers in any given sector to increase their collective power, to not just go after the person who might be signing your checks, but actually look at the person who's ultimately benefiting from our labor. And then the last one are community-driven strategies for bargaining, where working people organized as community members or in other economic relationships like tenants, debtors, and the like, patients, but that they also form the negotiating party, that they become the core bargaining unit, and they negotiate not necessarily with an employer, but with other entities that have economic power over their lives, such as building owners, corporate landlords, developers, just to name a few. So after another short video, we're going to be joined by an exciting group of experts for a discussion on some of the more specific experiences of workers testing these strategies. And I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists, so once we come back from that, we can dive right into the discussion. So first, I want to introduce Elisa McBride, who's the Secretary-Treasurer of AFSCME. Elisa joined the labor movement as a member of the United Auto Workers District 65 in 1989. In 1991, she was recruited to the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute and became a full-time organizer. She worked with factory workers to form unions and win first contracts in North Carolina, Texas, Ohio, Vermont, and Rhode Island. Those are some pretty tough states. She went on to become the New England Organizing Director for the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers and to direct the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute. McBride joined AFSCME as the Director of Education and Leadership Training Department in 2001. She led the creation of AFSCME's Leadership Academy, which helps AFSCME leaders build strong local unions. She developed AFSCME's Faces and Voices training program, giving librarians, healthcare workers, school bus drivers, and other AFSCME members the tools to be effective communicators on behalf of their union brothers and sisters. And she also serves on our Jobs with Justice National Board. We recently discovered a personal connection that goes 25 years back to an organizing drive at a Kmart in Greensboro, North Carolina. So Elisa and I have been in relationship, whether we knew it or not, for a very long time. Stacey Davis Gates is the Vice President of the Chicago Teachers Union and the Executive Vice President of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. Prior to her current role at the CTU, she served as the union's political and legislative director. This past fall, she helped to lead a 15-day strike and to negotiate a historic contract that provides for smaller class sizes, ensures a nurse and a social worker in every Chicago public school, secures sanctuary protections for immigrant families, and supports students and families experiencing homelessness. While at the CTU, Stacey raised millions of dollars to elect classroom teachers to all levels of local government and to challenge school privateers and union busters. Davis Gates also spearheaded statewide legislative campaigns to pass the strongest charter school accountability measures in the country and push for the restoration of the bargaining rights of Chicago public school employees. Stacey taught high school social studies for over a decade, and she attended St. Mary's College, the University of Notre Dame, and Concordia University. She lives on the south side of Chicago with her husband and 3 children. And then last on our panel will be Pamela Resendez Trujano, Executive Director of Colorado Jobs with Justice. Pamela is a graduate of the University of Texas at San Antonio, holds a bachelor's of political science. Post-graduation, she completed an internship with the Mexican American League Defense and Educational Fund, or MALDEF, more commonly known, and began working with the labor movement in Albuquerque as a member coordinator for Working America and as a mobilization coordinator with the Dallas Central Labor Council. After serving as executive director of Texas Jobs with Justice, Pamela moved to Denver to serve as deputy director of United for a New Economy. Pamela is excited to use all of these skills and experiences from running field programs, developing memberships, supervising and coaching staff, and preparing trainings to continue the work of Colorado Jobs with Justice to advance and defend workers' rights and the intersectional identities that workers hold. So before we hear from our guests, we want you to see a short video. One of the questions I often get is that, look, Smiley, this all sounds great, but, where do I start? So in the spirit of the get rich quick infomercial step by step, we compiled a short DIY video for anyone interested in this topic of organizing and collective bargaining, particularly expanded bargaining, for the first time. Please watch the video.
I hope you enjoyed the video. Here we go. Again, if you get stuck when we come back, just use your control to slide it back to the people view to see our panelists. Enjoy learning about expanded bargaining. Well, we hope that you are in and are going to enjoy the rest of this panel. Again, just move your slide if you need to get back to the panel view.
Thank you, everyone. Well, what do you think of that? Are you in? Of course, there are many detailed steps and nuances not laid out in that video, but it certainly gets us started, wouldn't you say? You know, all of our work begins in relationships with each other and with the powers in the economy that have deep impact over our lives. That's really the real point of this. So let's get to the discussion. So I actually would like to start with Lisa and Stacey. You may have something to add to this as well. And there's a little bit of echo. We'll put you on mute in case you hear something. So, Elisa, AFSCME primarily represents people working in state and local government positions, you know, and often the interests of your members are aligned with the interests of communities they live and work in, such as the need for well-funded and staffed departments that adequately provide a set of public services. You know, where do you see opportunities in the public sector to introduce new issues to bargain over, or new spaces to bargain in, and what role should we in the community play? And maybe after Elisa gets a first stab, it would also be good to hear from you, Stacey, since you're also in a similar position as a teacher.
Thanks, Smiley, and thanks to everyone who's together virtually. It's a good way to be together because it's our only way right now. I'm grateful for that. I actually wanted to start with a story that I think speaks to the question, Smiley. In Louisville, Kentucky, AFSCME Local 4011 represents school employees. And in the pandemic, they're continuing to serve their community by providing healthy meals to kids, by setting up food distribution centers. And they've been doing that all throughout this time. And in addition to the ongoing service that they're providing in a new way, they've also taken a core union principle, which is the need to stay organized and mobilized and in communication with each other into the community. They've set up these 9 zones in the city of Louisville where members live. And each zone has a leadership structure so that people who need help within the bargaining unit can find each other and connect with each other geographically. So it's taking this concept that we have in our union called the member action team, which is to communicate and mobilize for action, and taking it back to the community. And that story is a real reminder of the life-saving value of solidarity, which I think is something that we're all learning or learning again right now. But that story also highlights this urgent need for funding for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments right now, because every day public service workers are making sure that kids are eating, that we have safe water coming out of our taps, that unemployment insurance claims are getting filed, that garbage and recycling are getting picked up, that 911 calls are getting answered. This is the work that's often unseen and taken for granted, but it sustains our lives and livelihoods. And the federal government's got to bridge the gap. And they failed to do so in the most recent bill, in large part because of the senator, coincidentally, from Kentucky, where this local is, Mitch McConnell. And I just want to acknowledge, I know a lot of folks in the Jobs with Justice Network have already been on the phones and putting pressure on their federal legislators, but also on mayors and legislators at the state level to put pressure on those Congress members and senators. This is a time, this is not about right and left, it's about right and wrong. We have got to have robust public services, and we've also got to have unions that represent those public service workers, because every time workers who are school employees or other public service workers negotiate, they're by definition bargaining for the common good. They're bargaining to make sure that kids are fed, to make sure that there is a decent, reasonable number of cases for social workers. They're bargaining to make sure, for example, now they're bargaining to make sure that there are moratoriums on evictions in some places. They're advocating for prisoner release when they work in corrections facilities. You know, there's lots of current versions of this, but it's always about a core principle, which is that when we negotiate for our communities as well as for working conditions for public service workers. So we can dig deeper on that, but I just want to remind that myself and all of us that this is about a core principle. It's about doing things in a new way, but because there are some truths that are still with us about the power of collective action.
And I just retweeted you, by the way, or maybe tweeted you the first time. My language is off, right? It's not about right and left. It's about right and wrong. And just to like build on it, maybe both of you can respond to how COVID-19, do you feel like this has opened up more of these opportunities for, building power, particularly in states like Kentucky or in other states where collective bargaining rights are maybe a little more limited than they might be in, say, New York?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stacy, do you want to speak to that, and then I'll jump in again?
What I would say is that our collective bargaining rights, in Illinois as a whole, are largely protected. Our rights as members of the Chicago Teachers Union since 1995 have been marginalized. Little known fact is that our ability to basically bargain over the things that we went on strike for this past fall were more narrow than it appeared. And so that's where this whole concept of bargaining for the common good is actually helpful, I think, because we were able to connect our issues beyond the bargaining table to what made sense for the city of Chicago and for the students and the families that we serve every day in our school communities. What we've learned overall from the teacher rebellions in red states is that collective bargaining, our ability to maneuver in collective bargaining, no matter if the rights are marginal or if they are wide, have everything to do with how we organize, how we envision our fight, and how bold we're willing to be in this fight. And I think that's instructive for now. Think about what we're facing. Many of us are mourning. Many of us are, dealing with the Groundhog Day impact of being sheltered in place and can't necessarily see a bold moment, but we see the world falling down around us. And if we're clear about our power as labor, the resources that we have in labor, but also the need for a clear voice to identify that workers are what's holding up America right now, and that there isn't a demand, quite frankly, that it's too bold for this moment, especially when you have postal workers. A 31-year-old Black woman in the city of Chicago with 3 children just had a baby. She's dead, right? Especially when you see Black men who work in a group home and who's been in that group home sheltered in place for the last 45 days but does not make $15 an hour. Our boldness has to meet the moment and not necessarily the letter of the law.
No, that's really helpful. And both of you talked about the base building components of this, both in keeping and fighting form. And I'm actually curious if we could just draw that out a little bit before we go to Pamela. The common good approach in the organizing collective bargaining of both of your unions is really evident, and including in CTU through your most recent strike, where issues of affordable housing and more funding for schools was front and center. How is this approach? Because a lot of times the criticism we get is these expanded bargaining ideas are really cute, they're nice, they're good ideas, but like we need things that are scalable and we need to build our base, right? And how have you actually seen this approach activate your members and expand your base of allies?
I lost you for a minute there. Was that for Stacy or for me?
For both of you. I mentioned Stacy's last contract. It'd be good to hear from both of you this idea of incorporating some of these broader issues into organizing and negotiations. How has that actually helped you build your base as opposed to shrinking it?
I mean, for us here in Chicago, I don't know how to do it any other way. When I began my work with the Chicago Teachers Union, the idea of community labor coalition was already a thing. So I stepped into that model, if you will. And quite frankly, I don't know how you can advocate in the public sector without also advocating for the 360 of the lives of those in the public sector. Let's be real. Those of us who are represented in the public sector are people of color largely, are females largely. And because we have that distinction, then you also have to be clear about what is happening to people of color in our society, what's happening to women in our society. And so to adequately represent the needs of workers, I can get a check, I can get benefits, but I'm also going back into neighborhoods that may be unsafe or overly surveilled by police. I may be going back into spaces where childcare is too expensive and the check that I have doesn't go far enough. Or it's hard for me to punch in on time because the neighborhood school in my community no longer exists. And so, my children have a hike to school, or I have a hike to school, or I have a hike after work to pick them up. So what's real in a worker's life extends beyond the time that they punch in and they punch out. And if we're not representing that, then what is the reason for us?
I would just add, I think this moment does create both, it's a crisis and an opportunity. And it really highlights the fact that having a voice and power on the job is a life and death matter, especially when the working class is in harm's way. And just in our union, we know of more than 200 members who have died as a result of COVID-19. Most of them are working on the front lines, and it's a place that is dangerous and deadly. And when you've got a voice on the job, you can advocate. Just as a really narrow example, the first grocery store near me that had plexiglass shields and really good PPE, personal protective equipment, was the unionized Giant. Thank you, UFCW. Thank you, members who advocated, because it mattered to me as a customer as well as to them. So we do need to expand the right to organize and have a voice on the job. And I think folks on this plenary know it, but just it's worth reiterating that unlike the private sector, there is no federal law that enables public sector workers to organize and bargain on the job. We have to win it city by city, state by state, county by county. And so there are many, many, many public sector workers who do not have a voice on the job and are currently fighting for one. And you saw some of them in the video, because those Red for Ed strikes were mostly in places where workers don't have the right to organize and bargain. And in my own home state of Maryland, there's a county where public workers, sanitation workers, just literally this month won legislation that enables them to organize and bargain on the job in Maryland, in the U.S. in 2020. So we got a long way to go. In Virginia, until this year, it was not just that there was no legislation enabling collective bargaining for public sector workers, it was banned. And that just changed, in part because an AFSCME member, a union sister named Elizabeth Guzman, got elected to the state legislature and put forth a bill, collective bargaining rights. It's limited. It only enables localities to vote to give workers who work for those localities the right to organize, but it's a start. It's not the end, it's a start. In California, childcare providers who are independent providers of public services, private sector, but doing work in the public interest, and talk about a necessary job right now, the job that makes many other jobs possible. They just won the right to organize for the first time, 40,000 childcare employees in California. And we are working with SEIU to support those workers. They have an election in June. In Oregon, behavioral health workers who work for nonprofits, private nonprofit agencies, they're organizing citywide in Portland to say, whether we're union or non-union, we need a collective voice to advocate for better conditions for ourselves, for those we serve, for the resources we need to deal with the crises that people are facing right now. And they're starting to make a difference as a collective, both in terms of really fighting with the whole sector, but also organizing agency by agency where they can, because there's huge turnover in those jobs. And more than ever, we need folks to stay in behavioral health work and make it a job that is a good job to have so that those folks can serve the communities that need behavioral health services. So these are just some examples of how we're trying to push out the boundaries of who's got the right to organize and bargain and advocate. And as you know, while workers are doing that organizing, they're also finding ways to make their voices heard and show their power collectively. And that's in large part due to the alliance between workers and community, and Jobs with Justice is at the center of that.
Well, no, I appreciate both of those comments. I feel like there are a couple of themes coming out of what you two are saying, and I want to bring Pamela into the discussion. You know, the first, that this isn't new necessarily, this idea that people are negotiating outside of what's legally allowed, and in fact that it's actually not legally allowed for many public sector workers who aren't often thought of as alt labor or however, like the New York Times wants to describe them on any given day, but that actually are continually fighting for the right to organize and collectively bargain. And being from North Carolina, I know that very sharply, where it was illegal to organize and collectively bargain, and also understanding that the public sector has very much been a pathway for Black communities and certainly for my family to have economic sustainability. So this is a deep issue. The other theme coming out of which I appreciated out of both your comments, was this notion that it, again, is also not new, this idea of organizing workers as whole people. Very few people will first and only identify as a worker when you ask them who they are and what they do and what they're about, and that it's actually our job to bring those whole people into the movement together. And with that, I wanted to check in with Pamela, because you know, this pandemic has created a situation where not only is what Stacy and Elisa described as whole people organizing the right thing to do, but it's become more urgent and even necessary. And, you know, like many others in the Jobs with Justice Network, Colorado J with J took on a housing fight recently, which is somewhat unusual for an organization focused on workers and collective bargaining. Why did this seem important for the workers you're engaging locally, and what unions and organizations are involved and kind of prompted it?
Can you hear me? Cool.
We got you.
Thank you for having me. I think that the reason why this is now impacting specifically union members that may have not seen this as an issue for them before, because they weren't necessarily living paycheck to paycheck, but maybe rather 2 to 3 paychecks away from a financial crisis individually. But now, because of the pandemic, there's been a magnifying lens on the housing crisis, right? People are no longer being able to figure things out in a way that they can move rent money. And the reason that I would say this is something that we're working on is because now workers are seeing the impacts of the housing crisis magnified to them. We've had a lot of opportunities to work with a lot of various other union partners, but the ones that are really showing up are the ones that y'all mentioned, which is like UFCW, SEIU, Local 105, Unite Here, Local 23. And that's because they are also being directly impacted by the way that they're either getting laid off or the way that they're having to not go to work getting COVID. So I would say that the reason why we're embarking on this, it's because the workers are now also seeing that intersection of like workers are renters and renters are workers. And even if you're a homeowner now, or you're still having to have that mortgage, right? So whenever we would do previous canvassing and people would be like, the housing crisis doesn't impact me because I'm able to buy a house and pay that mortgage, that is now being taken away, or that narrative is now being switched to, no, you're actually a renter as well. and your mortgage is sort of like that payment.
I'm curious. I see like nodding heads from Lisa and Stacy. I'm curious how that sits with you all. Are you experiencing the same thing? This idea of workers as renters, or people having a different awareness about their role and identity in that way?
I think our members here in Chicago, I'm sorry, our members here in Chicago are still working, so they're still being paid. And the reality of our situation in Chicago was that we went into COVID with about 20,000 students already documented as homeless students. And so this idea that we can shelter in place as a homeless person is a big deal, which means that takes this fight about being able to open up the Chicago Housing Authority wait list and prioritize families so they have shelter. The idea of having a whole slew of hotels in downtown Chicago and surrounding area completely empty because of sheltering in place, but also having students who are homeless, their families who are homeless and unable to, grab Wi-Fi and a device and participate in the school space has become real, to a whole like swath of people. And then just the precarious nature in general of the work lives of our parents. We have parents who work in nursing homes. We have parents who work in hospitals. We have parents who work in the gig economy, in the restaurant industry, who are no longer working. These are real when you are trying to, you call home and you ask people how they're doing, and they tell you how they're doing. They tell you that they are, weeks away from eviction. They tell you that they're one paycheck away from eviction. And then what do you talk about? You talk about grades? You talk about curriculum? You talk about attendance in a Zoom meeting? Or do you talk to them about the fight for rent control? Do you talk to them about how, we can work together and make, real clear and specific demands? Do you talk to them about mutual aid and what it will take to make sure that they can meet their rent? Or do you sign them up for renters unions so they too can be radicalized in this moment? Like, our union is playing a very specific and clear role in organizing parents who are parts of this larger community to fight back. I mean, look, the reality is we're inside of a revolution. Whatever is happening, it could get worse or it could get better. The imagination of the workers in this moment and the leaders in this moment is going to have to be bolder, more aggressive, and clearer. And we're also going to have to think about organizing across sectors. I'm not just involved in organizing other educators. We have to be involved in organizing those who we know need the strength of our resources and our ability to grab a megaphone and get attention. Like, this whole concept of recovery in the school community is predicated on the recovery of the larger community. And so if we are not in position to address rent control, to address homelessness, to address basic universal income, I mean, let's keep it 100. Send people a check every month until we can see our way out of this. And that's just the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate that. And Elisa, I see you want to jump in. Get Pamela on one other question, and then we'll respond. And then also, this is such a great conversation. We're already generating some great Q&A. So for those who have questions, make sure you chat those. We're going to come back to you in just a moment here. But before Lisa also responds to the question, Pamela, I mean, I know part of this effort is to build some form of tenant union in Denver. I mean, this panel is about bargaining for our future, right? So, how are you imagining tenants not just helping to set policy, but actually being in negotiation with corporate landlords, for example?
Yeah, I think that going back to what was mentioned before, this is also an opportunity, right? Like, this is the moment where folks that previously wouldn't talk or engage with their neighbors are now coming in communication digitally, right? So how do we continue to engage folks that may have never communicated the concerns that they had against a corporate landlord or their current livelihood outside of their workplace? And how are we actually now able to build those long-lasting relationships through this opportunity of engaging digitally, right? And doing digital organizing. And going back to sort of doing that popular education in that intersecting lens of like, yes, you are a worker, but you're also, you could be a parent, you could be part of a larger community, and housing is impacting them as well, right? So it's all these people coming together and building the stages of how to build tenant union power and how to do it in a moment now where people are communicating with each other. How are tenants that are that live in corporate apartment complexes now coming together to try to put demands forth to a corporation that they had never really engaged with before, besides writing their check, right? So there's now a shift in the way that tenants and workers and all these different identities that we hold are coming together to hold corporate landlords accountable and put that policy, and besides the policy that we're trying to create in the legislative session or municipal level, is how are we having that power to bargain directly with those actors, right? And it doesn't necessarily just have to be a corporate landlord. It can also be as small as your building of 15 to 20 apartments. I know that this crisis has also impacted a lot of small businesses and the way that they're doing their mortgage and having to pay their mortgage. So what does it look like for businesses to come together, create a business mortgage-like union, and start doing that advocacy also together against those corporate banks, right, that are the ones that are trying to take away that business? So I would say at this moment, we really do have an opportunity to organize everyone, specifically online, and make sure that we're able to build that power, that people power, right, to hold the corporate landlords, to hold the banks, to hold elected officials accountable in a way that hadn't been really done before, because it was a crisis, but now it's going to be as important as finding a solution after the pandemic, right?
Yeah, no, really important. And, you know, even when you think about some of who these corporate landlords are, like Steven Feinberg, who, you know, owns part of a grocery store chain that is union, and he also owns like residential housing where he might have tenants. Some of those people may be the same people. There's a lot of overlap. You know, companies negotiate with each other contracts every day, with banks, with each other, with other entities. You know, why should workers be limited to just one channel? We should be able to negotiate enforceable agreements in all those arenas. I'm curious, Elisa, I know you've been nipping to chime in because you know, both from your experience at AFSCME, and I know just from your own interaction with the neighborhood, a lot of us are getting more in touch with this aspect of ourselves. I'm curious what you're experiencing when it comes to working with poor people in this way.
You know, I was just going to add one more example, and I know you want to turn to questions, so I hope that's where we go, but just very briefly, the child care providers in California I mentioned have been putting heat on the governor, along with others, around an eviction moratorium. So it's just an example. It matters to them, but it matters to the families that they serve as well. So Jobs with Justice has always been a place where these kinds of alliances and coalitions can be built. I think this is a moment of opportunity for that as well, because it's so clear what is needed, and getting people to unite around some of those demands, whether it's locally or nationally, is really important right now. And I think we can do more of it.
Yeah, there really is something about even just naming, you know, who's benefiting, not just in general, but particularly from this moment. I mean, we mentioned in the opening, Jeff Bezos got $24 billion in the last couple of months off of the pandemic. The CEO of Amazon, certainly Sam Zell and Steve Feinberg and others could benefit from the current bill that's in Congress that would just give them the rent so that we don't have to pay. I think there's a lot in it to make it really clear that there are a set of ultimate benefactors and profiteers that are actually benefiting off of our suffering, and to clarify that for people in a way that mobilizes us and makes us stronger. So I'm curious what others are thinking. We got a few questions, and I'm going to go to Jessica to help us compile them so that we can try to get some reactions from our panel.
Great. It's been a fantastic panel. Thank you. We do have questions. I'm going to read them off here. We have lots of upvotes going on. Continue to vote and enter your questions in even while we're in this session. I'll be monitoring them. Our first question is, loan debt impacts millions of students across the country. How can we join together and renegotiate these terms? Send that to the panel is the first question.
Okay, so talking about loan debts, particularly in this case, student loans, how can we join together to renegotiate those payments? So this is another potentially community-driven strategy towards negotiating with one percenters, but certainly this has been an issue amongst workers, right, directly, in the sense I remember a group of teachers in Massachusetts several years ago saying that the biggest raise they had gotten was when they got their public loans or student loans forgiven through the public service loan forgiveness program. Do you all have, particularly looking at you, Elisa and Stacy, do you have thoughts on student loan debt forgiveness and how that's impacting your base? And then, of course, how we might.
It's a huge fight. It affects so many members of our union and potential members, and not just recent graduates, but the parents and grandparents who are carrying debt. And we've been fighting on it for years. And I think it's a great example of the kind of a way to boost the economy, which these guys claim that we need to do. And I'm saying guys on purpose. So it seems like a great demand in this moment. And, I'll leave it at that. I think, and I think there's an 8-point or 10-point process in your video for how to do this.
We did put out the DIY, right?
We'll be sharing that video later.
Yeah. Debt organizing for dummies. We'll do it. We'll figure that out. Pamela or Stacy, do you want to weigh in on this before we go to the other question?
I think the only thing that I would say is that that debt, right, that student debt is carried multi-generationally, right? So like it was mentioned, it's parents, it's grandparents, it's older siblings in my case. And the moment that we're in, it's just like, why are we still having to deal with debt in the middle of a crisis? So I think that there's enough momentum and power for us to be like, we need to stop like pretending that it's business as usual and writing that check to your student debt and actually being like, we need to figure out the priorities that we need to acquire to survive right now, and then what it looks like long term to eliminate that we shouldn't have, because education should not be a privilege. It should be accessible to everyone. So it's like those conversations that we can be having multi-layer with our different identities as either teachers, as employees, as workers, as part of the community, and start peeling back why we continue to engage in a moment where there's a pandemic and worry about our debts.
Great. And then maybe, Jessica, why don't we get like 2 or 3 questions off the list?
2 more.
Yeah. Yep. Get them all at once here.
Next question, with nationwide cuts to public education imminent and an austerity and punishing response to COVID budget cuts, do you see an opportunity for possible second Red for Ed wave, broadly impacting CTU community coalition tactics? As the first question. And the second question we have, in Northern California, we're also dealing with immigrant workers and homelessness. We have homeless workers who have to shelter in place and immigrant workers who have little to no options for any kind of assistance until now. And then someone's talking about setting up a DocuFund. So just sort of recognizing that and asking the panelists to reflect.
Well, I don't know how we survive this next phase without aggressive militant action. That's just the bottom line. Someone just talked about Jeff Bezos becoming a trillionaire during a pandemic where disproportionately Black people and brown people who work in his warehouses are dying. It seems pretty unfair. Those same people have children who will be in school communities where they will just be told we don't have enough, and so it'll be what it is. Our imagination is going to have to be a little bolder and bigger than what it has been. And I know I keep repeating that, but people are going to tell us, elected officials, they're going to pay for talking points to be repeated, ad nauseum, in mainstream media, that there is a fair share sacrifice that we must have, from our classrooms to our retirement to security to everything, right? We know what happened in 2008 with the recession and what happened afterwards. Heck, the recession is what got us the bold militant action of Red Fred in the beginning. This is worse, and it's going to get worse unless we say, look, rich people got to pay their fair share. Like, we're not hearing about the stock market taking, huge tumbles. We're also seeing the response from the federal government focus on large corporations and banks and hold them tight because they need to be held tight. At least that's what they're telling us. In order for us to get what we need, we're going to have to be in a position of taking bold risk to shut it down. We're going to have to think through, what does intersectional labor movement mean, and that it cannot just be teachers, but it also has to be Uber drivers. It also has to be Instacart workers. We're going to have to see our power in the leadership of women. We're going to have to see our power in the leadership of Latinx and Black folks who comprise the worker class, the heroes that we keep lifting up in this moment. And it's just going to have to be unyielding, and we're going to have to talk about racism very clear. Look, they're going to come first to centers where Black people have suffered the most and have an expectation that we continue to suffer. We're going to have to say no. We're going to have to name it as racism. We're going to have to say austerity is sexist and it's racist, and we're just going to have to say no and risk this idea of a strike during a pandemic. We have 40 nursing homes, workers who were going to go on strike here in Illinois just a week ago. So it can be done. And these are people who are on the front line, who don't make a lot of money, and who are fighting for PPE, the right to stay alive. So we're going to have to take that example of courage and push it a little further out.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you actually answered, I think, another question from the chat. So why don't we get just the last, whatever the last ones are on there, so that we can at least have some responses to each of them, and then we'll wrap up.
Go to our first question. Is there anything in the works to allow property owners to collect unemployment if that is their only income? This seems to be the go-to excuse when discussing rent moratoriums with my local government.
Great. And then I saw another question just on the shareholder season. Are we paying attention to the shareholder meetings and researching large companies other than Amazon that are building cash reserves on the backs of workers, making them take vacation and claim UI so that they can just build up their own reserves? So these are two questions. What do folks think about this? I mean, this is, on the latter one, I think it's clearly a yes, and it's certainly something that I know we've been paying attention to in the stimulus, and I know, Elisa, you all have been paying attention to some of this as well, making sure that any recovery goes directly to workers, keeping them on payroll, not to buyouts and debt payments and CEO payments and that kind of thing. What do you think about that one? And and then we can get to the other question too, about this question of support for unemployment for people who property ownership is their only income, which is a whole other question. We'll get to that one in a second.
Yeah, I sort of feel like, Smiley, you should respond to these. You might be the best positioned.
Yeah, I haven't put on the moderator hat.
Watchdog. Yeah. I mean, it's going to take vigilance. It's going to also take power because there's already all sorts of horrible behavior going on. And I know the AFL-CIO is monitoring it. And so central labor councils and state feds are a way to engage that. But Jobs with Justice and other allies have been doing the same. So I think you should share your thoughts.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you for permission, Elisa. See, this is why you're on our national board. So pulling my facilitator hat off, I do have strong opinions on these. I mean, first, for the property owners who that's their sole source of income, there are so many different ways they can access the assets of their property without going to get congressional money. You know, they can take out loans on them. They can, borrow against them. They can do all kinds of things to sustain themselves in ways that workers don't have access to. So I don't really buy that they need unemployment at all. I actually think that's a bit of a cop-out, right? Secondly, I mean, I'm sure there's some more nuances than that, and I'd be curious to see if you all have answers, but I don't buy it very much at all. But I definitely agree with what you said, Elisa, on this question of how we hold companies accountable who are going to use this moment just to kind of save themselves and push us all out. And this is really what was behind the worker actions earlier this month during the rent strike, was to say, we can't pay, but we shouldn't have to. You can't hold us to this. You also have to have some shared sacrifice in this global pandemic. I think that there was a funny moment when I was actually interviewed by Forbes, because our comms team is amazing, and this somehow miraculously turned into a good story, where the industry lead from the big real estate companies, the corporate real estate companies, was like, you guys, this isn't fair. You're just gonna, we have to pay bills too, and you should ask Congress for relief. Meanwhile, these are like, billion-dollar companies and billion-dollar executives, and it's I think it really just exposed how entitled they are. So we should get relief with our tax money to pay them, to make them richer. And this goes back to this whole point about this is our money. It's our money. Like they're talking about our money. Azar is talking about our tax dollars when he's talking about a vaccine that won't be affordable to most of us. The industry actor in that real estate article was talking about our money being used to pay him and his people so that they could pay their whatever bills that they pay and continue to get rich. So I think there is a real clarity that this moment has helped provide for us when it comes to some of these corporate actors. And we certainly can't do as much shareholder mobilization as we would like to in this moment. But the idea that workers are stakeholders in these fights and should be, the companies should be equally responsible to the interests of us than to just the shareholders and investors, is something that we can use, we can elevate in this moment in a really powerful way. So that would be my response. And I want to give, as we're rounding up, each of the panelists just a little bit of time for closing thoughts, and then we'll pivot to wrap up. Why don't we start with you, Pamela, since we came to you last, and then we'll circle back to Elisa.
I think also just to going back to what in this moment folks without housing, right, like homeless folks or folks that are being left out of packages, state package relief. I think that it's at this moment it's because we are coming to the realization that we all deserve housing, right? It doesn't matter whether you work one job, whether you don't work. It comes down to us figuring out a way to understand how housing is a human right, and that we should have a roof over our heads regardless of whether we're employed, whether we're not employed, of whether we have one job or multiple jobs, right? Like it shouldn't come to who's deserving of housing. At this moment in the pandemic, we still see sweeps happening for folks without housing, homeless folks, where their tents are being destroyed, right? And it's the moment of how is this happening during a health pandemic where we're being asked to stay at home and yet we might be evicted or we might not even have a home to begin with. So I would say that, to echo what folks had said, like, I think at this moment we need to realize that we need to take bold risks in a way that we've never done it before, because we've never been in a moment like this before. And now it's the time to really be as imaginative as we can be, and be as a discipline as we can be in a movement, because not only are we workers, we're also consumers. And I think it's just coming to the understanding that without workers, without us, like, all of this falls apart. Like, we're literally the ones that are sustaining right now the economy as workers, and we can at any point organize to make sure that our interests are also met during this moment. And how do we shift that from the narrative of, like, we need to make sure that corporations are being held accountable, to, like, no, like, we are gonna hold y'all accountable because we are running this, and being that sort of bold when it comes to making demands, not making asks.
Thank you, Pamela. And Stacey.
What she said. I mean, like, look,
what they said.
Yeah, like, honestly, if we're waiting on someone to ask us to be healthy, to be organized, to be human beings, then we're going to continue to wait for that. Look, I am reminded that capitalism always has a business plan prepared for the death of people. You know, if we're talking about racialized capitalism, let's talk about the number of Black bodies who were lost in the Middle Passage. The number of Black bodies that were lost, you know, during the entire transatlantic slave trade. That being said, we already know how difficult this is, where it goes, who loses the most, and who is deprioritized and dehumanized. We know that. We know where the pity headlines are going to be centered. What we have to do, those of us who are smart, those of us who are strategic thinkers, those of us who are fearless activists and organizers, we have to be about it in this moment. We're in a revolution. Let's name it. This is a revolution. We're in it. How do we collectively seek the leadership of those who have already lost the most and who need to win the most? How do we then focus on naming who our opponents, who our enemies are, their playbook? Look, they're going to find power in this chaos. They're going to find money, they're going to find more resources, and they're going to replicate. What do we find? Like, we have to, and for those of us who are in book studies right now, I'm not fronting on book studies, and what I'm saying is, chew gum and walk at the same time. We're going to have to push back. When they talk to us about, you know, the U.S. Postal Office shutting down, no, that's a non-starter. And what do we have to do to push back on those things? We have to figure out, what does a general strike look like across this country? What does it look like when people cannot get the meat from the packing companies? What does it look like when you can't buy the meat from the grocery store? What does it look like when the Instacart person can't deliver it to your door? What does it look like when across sectors we are saying no more? When does it look like when across sectors we are seeing women organize, strategize, be the voice, and be the leaders of this movement? It's now. We cannot wait for it. We cannot have an activity, an action, or a synthesis in a year. We kind of just got to go for it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. Lisa, last word.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to where I started, which is that there's a huge amount at stake right now, and there's going to be another push for austerity, and the implications of that for everybody, but disproportionately for people of color and white women who are disproportionately supported by jobs in the public sector, but also disproportionately on the front lines, disproportionately impacted by the economic crisis. You know, this is a time when we've got to make a real ask for government intervention. We've got a new bill, and it's a short-term thing, like in the next 24 hours, but that bill does make a robust effort to fund state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. It includes an OSHA standard, which right now it's a disgrace how little OSHA is showing up. It includes additional direct payments and extension of unemployment benefits. This is what we need right now. And this one's going to be a much harder push. So I just want to invite everyone to holler about it. Holler to your member of Congress, holler to your senator, call Mitch McConnell, even if you're not his constituent, and remind him that he is a big barrier here. But call your mayor, call your state legislators, and get them to call those folks. We could really make this happen if we mobilize. And it's not easy to mobilize right now, but getting on the phone is one way to do that, getting on the email. And let's make sure that this Congress hears about the need to not go down the austerity path, but fund the front lines, fund public services, fund our communities.
Lisa, and that slide is actually up on your screens, folks, for you to take action either right after you get off of this or tomorrow morning. Give a call, 888-981-9704 to fund the front lines. And you can see that slide and copy that down. With that, thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Elisa, Stacy, Pamela. You all are amazing. I'm going to pass it back to Jessica to tell us what's next.
Hi, thank you again, panelists. And remember, the action number is still on your screen, the call to fund the front lines. So we're coming to the end of our first day. Thank you for being here with us. Just the logistics of letting you know, tomorrow morning you will get the URL for the new conference website. So it's a new page, and there'll be a new PIN code for you to actually enter as well. So it'll be laid out the same way. We're starting at 12 o'clock noon. Want to remind you to visit the topics section in the agenda. We have a lot of solidarity actions from across our movement that are looking for you for support so you can take action. And right now, we're actually going to show a short video for our Strikes board game. And every game purchased is actually getting a $5 donation for our Worker Solidarity Fund. So I hope that you have a great evening. You can buy that Strikes board game at TessaCollective.com. That's TessaCollective.com. And enjoy this movie about strikes. There's lots of great bonuses materials. I think you'll enjoy being able to play it. Thank you so much for being with us. Here we go.
Thank you, Jessica.
Welcome to the world of Strike, the game of Worker Rebellion, a strategic and beautifully illustrated cooperative board game for 2 to 4 players. HappyCorp, the richest company in the world, has just unleashed its most diabolical plan yet, turning your city into an entirely corporate-run metropolis. HappyCorp has already begun unleashing its smile drones to convert the city's infrastructure, crush protests, and ensure every resident watches its commercial breaks. Players take on the role of the Strike Council to lead a citywide rebellion against HappyCorp's takeover. Players will grow their ranks, mobilize their workers, and lead strikes around Mercury City. As the Strike Council scores victories for workers, they will gain the support of more allies, from the steel workers to the teachers, and build new bases of support from the manufacturing district to the university. But watch out, because if HappyCorp gets 3 drones into a city district, they fuse into one giant mega drone, and that's when the trouble really begins. Strike is a strategic and cooperative game. Every player takes on one of 8 unique characters, each with specialized skills and unique powers, like Valentina the factory worker, Hamza the student, Candace the firefighter, and Skylar the nurse. So will you soon be a smiling employee of Happy City, or do you have what it takes to lead the worker rebellion to defeat HappyCorp?
Well, we hope that you join us in leading the Workle Rebellion to beat Happy Corp. Thank you again for your time tonight. We will see you tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern. Look into your email for the new URL and PIN code. Have a good evening. Thanks again. Goodbye.